Welcome back. In this video, we're beginning a new study and a new video series. The first part of this video series will span multiple videos and will be establishing a series of events that reach from the covenant with the many to the abomination of desolation. That is, the first 3.5 years of Daniel's 70th week. The next part of this series will focus on the last 3.5 years, known as the Great Tribulation. Each video will build on the previous, so you won't want to miss any. I'll walk you through each event that must take place, and I'll show you when, why, and how each of the events will take place. Before we get started, I just want to say thank you so much for watching. Each of these topics are written as a full academic paper, which I've made available for free on my Substack. And that full written paper with citations and research notes and everything else is linked in the description below. It's free. I'm not here to gatekeep God's word, so if it's interesting to you, I recommend you check it out. So to get started, we need the foundational work of Daniel and his 70 weeks prophecy. And this is one of the most important prophetic messages in the Bible. Daniel chapter 9 and the 70 weeks prophecy. This is a passage that has generated a lot of debate, and for good reason. It deals with Jerusalem, the exile, the coming of the Messiah, the destruction of the city and the sanctuary, and the final week that later becomes so important for end times interpretation. But in this video, I want to focus only on the first 69 weeks of the prophecy. That means we're not going to try and solve every question about the final week right now. That deserves its own study. Daniel 9 begins with Daniel reading the prophet Jeremiah. Jeremiah had said that Jerusalem's desolation would last 70 years, and Daniel understands that time is connected to Israel's exile, Jerusalem's ruin, and God's covenant discipline on his people. In the first year of his reign, I, Daniel, perceived in the books the number of years that, according to the word of the Lord to Jeremiah the prophet, must pass before the end of the desolations of Jerusalem, namely 70 years. But Daniel does not respond by doing speculative math. He responds by praying. He confesses Israel's sin. He acknowledges that God has been righteous in bringing judgment. He appeals to God's mercy, and he asks God to forgive, restore, and act for the sake of his own name. We have sinned and done wrong and acted wickedly and rebelled, turning aside from your commandments and rules. This humbleness that Daniel has and the setting that he's in matters. Daniel 9 is not just about numbers. It's about covenant, it's about sin, exile, confession, restoration, atonement, and ultimately the coming of the Messiah. Then, Gabriel comes to Daniel and gives him the answer. While I was speaking and praying, confessing my sin and the sin of my people Israel, and presenting my plea before the Lord, my God, for the holy hill of my God, while I was speaking in prayer, the man Gabriel, whom I had seen in the vision at the first, came to me in swift flight and at the time of the evening sacrifice. Daniel had been thinking about 70 years. Gabriel expands that into 70 weeks, or more literally, 77s. 70 weeks, and in Hebrew, weeks is Shavuim, are decreed about your people and your holy city to finish the transgression, to put an end to sin, and to atone for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal both vision and prophet, and to anoint a most holy place. Know therefore and understand that from the going out of the word to restore and build Jerusalem, to the coming of an anointed one, a prince, there shall be 7 weeks, and for 62 weeks it shall be built again with squares and moat, but in a troubled time. And after 62 weeks an anointed one shall be cut off, and have nothing. And the people of the prince who is to come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary, and its end shall come with a flood, and to the end there shall be war, desolations are decreed. And he shall make a strong covenant with many for 1 week, and for half the week he shall put an end to sacrifice and offering. And on the wing of abominations shall come one who makes desolate, until the decreed end is poured out on the desolator. Again, the Hebrew word here is shavuim, meaning sevens or weeks. In this context, they are not ordinary 7-day weeks. They are best understood as sevens of years. That might sound strange at first, but the Bible itself gives us the category. In Leviticus 25, Israel is told to count 7 weeks of years, 7 times 7 years, marking 49 years. And in Genesis 29, Jacob's uncle confirms, the weeks of years again by saying, "Complete the week of this one, and we will give you the other, in return for serving me another 7 years." So, Scripture already has established the concept of a week of years. And that's important because Daniel is already thinking in those terms of years. Jeremiah's prophecy was about 70 years. Gabriel now gives Daniel a larger time structure, 77s, or 70 groups of 7 years. That means the 70 weeks are 70-year weeks. 70 times 7 is 490 years. But Daniel 9 does not present those 490 years as a single undivided block. The prophecy breaks them into parts: 7 weeks, then 62 weeks, then one final week. 7 and 62 are a total of 69 weeks, and 69 weeks of years equals 483 years. So the main question for this study is, where do the first 69 weeks begin, and where do they end? Daniel 9:25 gives us the starting point. It says the count begins from the going out of the word to restore and rebuild Jerusalem. That phrase is very important. The starting point is not simply a command to fund temple worship, and it's not merely about temple sacrifices. The text says Jerusalem is to be restored and built. That suggests the city itself, its public life, its civic life, its governed life, its covenantal identity. This is why the decree connected with Ezra during the reign of Artaxerxes is so significant. Ezra's commission was not only about temple support, it also involved restoring order among the returned people. It involved law, judges, magistrates, and the reconstruction of the community's life under God's law. Nehemiah later becomes very important for the rebuilding of the wall. But Daniel 9 is not asking only for the first wall-related decree. It's asking for the word that restores and builds Jerusalem as a functioning covenant city. That makes the Artaxerxes era authorization to Ezra in the 458-457 BC window a strong candidate for the beginning point. Now, Daniel divides the first 69 weeks into 7 weeks and 62 weeks, so the first 7 weeks equal 49 years. This marks the initial restoration era and phase. It's the period in which Jerusalem is being restored under pressure in troubled times. Then 62 weeks follow. These are not separate from the first 7. They continue in the same countdown. Together, the 7 and the 62 bring us to 69 weeks, or 483 years. So in this way, the prophecy gives us an initial restoration period, followed by a long runway toward the Messiah. Daniel 9:25 says this period runs to the coming of an anointed one, a prince. The word anointed one is Messiah language. In Hebrew, the word is Mashiach, meaning anointed one or Messiah. The key question is, what does the coming of the Mashiach refer to? I don't think it refers to Jesus' birth, and I do not think the 69 weeks terminate at the crucifixion. I won't get into the nitty-gritty of why that is here, but if you want to deep dive into the reasons, I recommend reading my article. But here's what you need to know. The reason is Daniel 9:26 says that after the 62 weeks, meaning after the completed 7 plus 62 sequence, the Messiah is cut off. So the Messiah's death happens after the 69-week terminus. This means the terminus itself is better understood as the Messiah's public manifestation. And in the gospel accounts, Jesus' baptism functions exactly that way. He is publicly identified. The Spirit descends, the Father speaks, his public ministry begins. And that is when Jesus steps into the public stage as the Messiah. And this fits Daniel's wording very well. The 69 weeks lead to the coming of an anointed one, and after that, the Messiah is cut off. So the order is important. First, the Messiah appears publicly, the coming of the Messiah. Then after that, he's cut off, the crucifixion. Then after that, Jerusalem and the sanctuary are destroyed. Daniel 9:26 says that after the 62 weeks, or after the 69, an anointed one shall be cut off and shall have nothing. It then says, the people of the prince who is to come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. That destruction points naturally to the Roman destruction of Jerusalem and the temple in 70 AD. And this also helps distinguish the Messiah from the prince who is to come. The Messiah is the anointed one, the Mashiach, who appears and is cut off. The coming prince is associated with the people who destroy the city and the sanctuary. The grammar in the text points to two different figures that can't be collapsed into a single person. The grammar itself doesn't allow for it. In this way, the Messiah, the Mashiach, is Jesus. The destroying people are connected with Rome, and then later, the prince who is to come. So now let's talk about the chronology. 69 weeks are 483 years. So if we begin at the 457 BC window and move forward 483 years, remembering that there is no year zero between BC and AD, we land in the mid to late AD 20s. And that is precisely the historical window in which Jesus' public ministry begins. This does not require us to force an artificially exact day. It is enough that the timeline converges on the period of Jesus' public manifestation via his baptism. And this approach does not require a special 360-day prophetic year calculation, since the starting point is anchored in Persian history, and the year-week pattern comes from ordinary covenant calendar logic. Standard years work perfectly fine. And that is one of the strengths of this reading. It doesn't need to manipulate the calendar, it simply follows the year-week structure and lets the timeline land where it lands. And where does it land? Well, it lands in the historical period where Jesus is publicly revealed as the Messiah. Now, this raises one of the most important points in Daniel 9. After the 69 weeks, Daniel 9:26 gives us events that happen after the terminus. The Messiah is cut off. Jerusalem and the sanctuary are destroyed. And then the text says that desolations are decreed to the end. That phrase matters. Daniel 9:26 does not say that everything after the 69th week must happen inside the next 7 years, the 70th week. It gives us an open-ended horizon, war, desolation, and movement toward the end. And that's why the so-called gap or pause between the 69th and 70th week is not an artificial insertion into the text. The text itself allows for it. In fact, the text seems to require some kind of interval, because the Messiah's death and Jerusalem's destruction both happen after the 69 weeks, and Jerusalem's destruction occurs decades after Jesus' public manifestation. So the prophecy itself leaves room between the 69th and the final 70th week. The final week is introduced in Daniel 9:27 with a distinct action. He shall make a strong covenant with many for 1 week. That is the trigger for the 70th week. But this study is not focused on identifying that he or explaining every detail of that final week. That'll come later. For now, the important point is that Daniel 9:27 begins the final week with a new initiating act, a covenant with the many for 1 week. That means the final week does not simply begin automatically the moment the 69th week ends. Daniel 9:26 gives us post-69 week realities. Daniel 9:27 then gives us the specific trigger for the final week. And this is where Matthew 24 becomes important. In Matthew 24, Jesus speaks about the gospel of the kingdom being proclaimed throughout the entire inhabited world as a testimony to all nations. And then the end will come. The Greek word here is oikumene, meaning the inhabited world or realm. Jesus places a mission horizon before the end. And that matters, because it explains why history does not immediately move from Messiah's appearance to the final consummation. Paul writes in Romans 11:25, "Lest you be wise in your own sight, I don't want you to be unaware of this mystery. A partial hardening has come upon Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles comes in." This is the reason for the gap between weeks 69 and 70. The Messiah comes, the Messiah is cut off, Jerusalem is destroyed, but the end doesn't arrive immediately, because God has ordained a witness to the nations. The gospel of the kingdom must be proclaimed. That means Matthew 24 does not merely allow an interval. It helps explain the purpose of the interval, along with Paul's writing in Romans 11. The gap is not empty time. It's mission time. It's witness time. It is the period in which the kingdom message goes out to the nations before the final end phase crisis arrives. And in that same chapter, Jesus specifically points readers back to Daniel when he speaks of the abomination of desolation. So Jesus himself is teaching us to read Daniel as still relevant to the end. This reinforces the idea that Daniel's final week remains future from the standpoint of Jesus' discourse, even though the Messiah has already come and will be cut off. This is one more theological pattern worth noticing. Both Daniel and Revelation use broken seven patterns for the final period of opposition. Time, times, and half a time, 42 months, 1260 days. This is the familiar 3.5-year period of end-time oppression, but it's not necessary in the study to prove the exact length of Jesus' public ministry. But there may be a meaningful contrast here. The Messiah's public mission is marked by proclamation, obedience, suffering, self-giving, and vindication, and it lasted for 3.5 years. The beast's final authority is counterfeit, anti-mission. It's blasphemy, coercion, false worship, persecution, and violence. If Jesus' public ministry is approximately 3.5 years, and the beast's final authority is also a half week, 3.5 years, then the pattern becomes theologically suggestive. The beast does not create something original. He parodies what belongs to Christ. Christ's mission brings truth, life, and atonement, and the beast's mission brings deception, death, and judgment. And Revelation makes it clear that the beast's authority is not ultimate. It's given, it's allotted by God, and bounded. It is temporary. So the 70 weeks prophecy does more than give us a timeline. It gives a theological structure. God is resolving the covenant crisis. God is bringing the Messiah. God is allowing the Messiah to be cut off. God is permitting Jerusalem's destruction and an extended period of desolation. God is sending the gospel of the kingdoms to the nations, and God will later activate the final week by his own appointed trigger. So the first 69 weeks can be summarized like this. Daniel is praying about Jeremiah's 70 years and Jerusalem's desolation. Gabriel responds by revealing 70 sevens, 70-year weeks, decreed for Daniel's people and the holy city. And the first 69 weeks consist of 7 weeks and 62 weeks, totaling 483 years. The countdown begins with the word to restore and build Jerusalem, best understood as a restoration of the city's covenantal and civic life. And that points strongly to the Artaxerxes era authorization connected with Ezra, around 458 or 457 BC. The first 7 weeks mark an initial restoration in troubled times. The following 62 weeks form a long runway to the Messiah's public manifestation. 69 weeks terminate not at Jesus' birth and not at his death, but at the public appearance as a Messiah, most naturally his baptism and the beginning of his public ministry. After that, Daniel says the Messiah is cut off. After that, the city and sanctuary are destroyed, and after that, desolations continue to the end. That open-ended language allows for the interval between the final week. Then, Daniel 9:27 introduces the final week with a new action, a covenant with many for 1 week. That is why the 70th week should be studied on its own terms. The first 69 weeks bring us to the public manifestation of Jesus the Messiah, and the gap after the 69th week is not a failure of the prophecy, it's part of the shape of the prophecy. The gap in the prophecy is the time after Messiah's coming, after his cutting off, after Jerusalem's destruction, but before the final week is triggered. And in that interval, the gospel of the kingdom goes to the nations. That's the big picture. Daniel 9 is not just a math problem. It is a covenant prophecy. It begins with exile and confession, it moves toward restoration and Messiah, and it explains why the Messiah's death and Jerusalem's destruction happen after the 69 weeks, and it leaves the final week to begin later, when the appointed covenant of Daniel 9:27 sets in motion. It also allows time for the fullness of the Gentiles to come in, just like Jesus said would happen, and so did Paul. In the next related study, we'll be looking into Daniel's 2300 days and what they mean. I really encourage you to subscribe so you don't miss it. What I'll be presenting is the work of some absolutely brilliant scholars, not me, and I believe, though, it's the first time that it's been presented to anyone outside of academia. Thank you so much for joining. The full paper, written with citations, the research notes, and everything else, is linked in the description below to my Substack. As always, God bless.